Okay, guys, moving into question 4, A, looking at defining the term pathogen. Now, I've put 28% here, and that indicates the proportion of students that actually got this question correct, which shows us the way in which we defined pathogen was actually obviously very incorrect, with 72% finding a bit of trouble with it. And I think the main thing that was the main difficulty here was actually differentiating between whether a pathogen was actually cellular or non-cellular. And we know a pathogen is all-encompassing. So if we were to say that only a pathogen was a cellular agent of disease, well, we know that we're actually excluding prions and viruses, because we know that prions and viruses still cause disease, but they are still under the umbrella term of a pathogen. So when we actually go through this, a pathogen is a causative agent of disease. It's not really differentiating or categorizing according to be cellular or non-cellular, because it is both cellular and non-cellular components. And so moving forward into it, we move into part B. And it says the diagram below shows a generalized pathogen with antigens on its surface. The immune system responds to antigens by making antibodies, and we know that in terms of the immune response. So here's our particular pathogen with its surface antigens. And B is actually getting us to draw an antibody that would be effective against this pathogen, and we need to label the different parts of this particular antibody. And this is the antibody that I've sketched. I think the main thing here, and it's obviously worth 2 marks, is one for the label and how it looks. So we need to know that there were the 4 different polypeptide chains. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritty and say that this was the heavy chain and that this was the light chain. We don't actually need to discriminate between those two. I think the big thing here is just to understand that there were 4 chains, okay? 2 here, 2 there, total of 4. There was the antigen binding site. Some students confuse that with the active site. We know is only 2 enzymes. So that's the antigen binding site. And we know it's actually by the lock and key method. It needs to be complementary to this particular surface antigen, hence why it's something of a circle or a semicircle in that regard. And that is all you really need to do for this question. No need for light chain, heavy chain, or the variable and non-variable sections. Simply the 4 polypeptide chains and the antigen binding site. So once we move from B into C, it says one way that antibodies work is by forming antigen-antibody complexes. And the diagram below shows 4 different pathogens that was aforementioned. And the question C is looking to illustrate on the diagram above how the antigen-antibody complexes form, and we need to use at least 4 antibodies in your drawing. And this is essentially an antigen-antibody complex. We know that the antigen and the antibody interact via that complementary site, or the antigen binding site. So we've actually illustrated this, but we know when the complex forms, it does this at different locations. So here, 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 and here. And that will lead us to our part II, but what this actually allows us to do is immobilize the pathogen through agglutination. And that actually means just the clumping of the antigens. I know I'm going to the next part, but this is somewhat how it should have looked like. Obviously on the assessor report, they draw it slightly differently. As long as you're looking at the 4 that are actually looking to bind and localize these particular antigens, then you got the mark correct. Then I want to just move forward into II. And it says explain how an antigen-antibody complex provides protection against these pathogens. So it's about protection. It's worth 2 marks. I've given 3 particular dot points, but again, it's all about the logic. So what do these antigen-antibody complexes actually do? They first and foremost immobilize the pathogen. They immobilize these particular 4. And it does that through agglutination. And agglutination is basically meaning the clumping together of these antigens. What does that allow the phagocytes to do? It allows the phagocytes to engulf the pathogens more readily. And that is given by these particular 3 steps. But again, understand the logic and the dot points throughout. When you're given these many lines, and I keep coming back to it, 4, people will always fill up the 4. The big thing is nice, clear, concise statements that are logical. And I think that's the main thing about these antigen-antibody complexes. We go through the first stage, it immobilizes. How does it do that? It goes through the process of agglutination, which means literally to clump together. And what does this allow? The phagocytes to engulf the pathogen more readily.